In my last video, I asked viewers to temporarily lay aside the internal evidence bearing on the synoptic problem for the sake of letting the early church have their say. We saw that while some disagreement may have existed over the exact order of Mark and Luke, there was complete agreement on the priority of Matthew. I determined that the two gospel hypothesis accounted for the greatest amount of patristic evidence. That is, if we let the early church fathers speak for themselves, the idea that Matthew wrote first, Luke wrote second, and Mark wrote third was the most consistent with what they say. I have already argued at length in a previous video that the supposedly decisive internal evidence for Markan priority can actually be reasonably interpreted on either the hypothesis that Mark wrote first or that Mark wrote last. The underdeterminative case for Markan priority on the basis of the internal evidence, I think, provides grounds for reconsidering the external evidence found in the early fathers. But that is just one leg for the two gospel hypothesis to stand on. There is another category of internal evidence which is equally compelling and which we will explore in this video. This evidence largely comes from apparent examples of Mark combining or conflating Matthew and Luke's narratives together. This so-called argument from conflation, if successful, decisively shows that Mark was written after Matthew and Luke, for both of these Gospels would clearly have to exist in order for Mark to conflate them. We shall examine this argument in detail before considering some more internal facts about Mark, which suggest that it was written third. Before we move to examine specific examples of conflation in Mark, it will be worth taking some time to explore the specific characteristics of conflated documents so as to see whether or not these same characteristics can be found in the relevant passages. Thomas Longstaff, in his excellent book on the topic, surveys several known examples of conflated documents. His study yields several interesting facts which tend to arise within a document as the result of conflating other documents together. The first and most obvious characteristic of conflation is that conflated texts exhibit alternating combinations of wording from the documents which have been conflated together. Second, documents which involve conflating two narratives together often have minute verbal agreements of one or only very few words with a source other than the one from which they have primarily been copying in any given conflated passage. As Longstaff says, the conflation of two or more sources which themselves exhibit a considerable degree of verbal similarity, will frequently, although not always, result in small agreements of a single word or a brief phrase with one source against the other. These agreements may interrupt the use of a single source or may occur alternately in a single section. Third, conflating authors often display a tendency to transition between sources at junctures where there is verbal agreement between those sources. Longstaff explains, it is significant that this phenomenon has been observed in every one of the authors whose method of conflation has been studied. It may, therefore, be considered another characteristic of this editorial method. Fourth, documents which involve conflation tend to be repetitive or repetitious or redundant in the conflated passages. Again, Longstaff explains, it may be concluded, therefore, that redundancy and duplication caused by the copying of similar words or phrases from two or more sources may be present in a conflated account. The presence of this phenomenon, however, is more probable when an author is copying everything or nearly everything found in his sources than when he is using his sources with greater freedom. With these characteristics firmly in hand, we may now turn to assess the proposed examples of conflation within Mark's Gospel to see if there is a match with known characteristics of conflated documents. It is important to remember at the outset that such examples can always be explained away through ad hoc and implausible theories. But if there are examples which display the known characteristics of conflation, then it is reasonable to suppose that conflation has occurred. Thus, while apparent conflation of Matthew and Luke is no proof of Mark's posteriority, it is indeed very strong evidence for it. There are 17 proposed instances where Mark has conflated Matthew and Luke together. Obviously, time precludes us from exploring all 17 of them, thus we shall restrict ourselves to just those examples where the case for conflation is strongest, even by the lights of Markan priorists. In the following examples, I have colored the text from Matthew blue and the text from Luke red, while coloring Mark blue where he agrees with Matthew and red where he agrees with Luke. This, I hope, will provide a vivid visual illustration to viewers of the phenomenon we are dealing with in Mark. Mark 1:29 through 34, the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, is perhaps the most famous example of this sort of phenomenon of alternating agreement between Matthew's wording and Luke's wording within Mark. A careful look at this passage will reveal not only that Mark's account exhibits alternating agreement between Matthew and Luke, a phenomenon which is characteristic of conflated documents, but that verse 32 also exhibits another telltale sign of conflation, redundancy. Mark says, "Now when the evening came, after the sun had set." The phrase, "now when evening came," follows Matthew, and the phrase, "after the sun had set," follows Luke. As Thomas Longstaff points out, it may be concluded, therefore, that although this analysis does not prove that Mark's summary statement is in fact a conflation of those found in Matthew and Luke, such a hypothesis is a plausible one, and one which seems better to explain the complex alteration of agreement and disagreement in this pericope than does the generally accepted two-document hypothesis. This example of conflation is even more compelling when we consider that the Greek phrase translated here as "when evening came" is a rare expression. It is used only 7 times in the New Testament, 6 of which are in Matthew's Gospel, and the other time is here in Mark. Clearly the phrase is distinctive of Matthew's style, making it more likely that Mark is borrowing the phrase from Matthew here than the other way around. As William Farmer says, on the Markan hypothesis, the critic is asked to imagine that Matthew copied this expression exactly as Mark had it the first time he encountered it, but thereafter, whenever he followed Mark in the use of this rare expression, he consistently deviated from Mark and rigidly restricted himself to this particular grammatical form. If Mark were secondary to Matthew, however, the critic would only be required to imagine that Mark tended to modify this Methane expression quite freely whenever he found it in his text of Matthew. That is, the critic would simply conclude that if Mark copied Matthew, he apparently had no objection to the expression, but that is not so much a part of his regular literary usage as to have assumed for him the form of a fixed stylistic introductory formula. Mark 1:42 is another striking example. Mark's account reads, "And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed." The parallel in Matthew 8:3 only has the last half of the statement, "and immediately his leprosy was cleansed." But the parallel in Luke 5:13 only has the first half, "and immediately the leprosy left him." Once again, it certainly looks like Mark has conflated together Matthew and Luke. Furthermore, this verse once again exhibits a sort of redundancy which is characteristic of conflated documents. As Bernard Orchard says, though it is possible that Matthew and Luke each adapted a separate half of Mark's sentence, not knowing that the other evangelist had chosen the other part, it is a lot easier to see Mark combining the phrases of both Matthew and Luke. Mark 3:1-6 likewise illustrates this pattern of alternating agreement with Matthew and Luke. The narrative in Mark begins by following Luke's wording very closely, yet near the middle, when Luke and Matthew's wording becomes very close, Mark appears to switch over to Matthew's wording. As we noted earlier, conflating authors have a tendency to transition between sources at just those junctures where the verbal agreements between or among their sources are very high. This looks like precisely what Mark has done with this story, making conflation a likely explanation for the pattern in Mark. Another example is Mark 5:12, "And the demons begged him, saying, 'Send us into the pigs so that we may enter them.'" The phrase, "send us into the pigs," follows Matthew's wording, whereas the phrase, "so that we may enter them," follows Luke's wording. And notice how redundant Mark is. Redundancy, as we have seen, is a telltale sign of conflation. It's very unlikely that Matthew and Luke independently each chose to adopt the separate half of this sentence. It's much more plausible that Mark combined Luke and Matthew together. As Pearson Parker states, "Some of Mark's most famous gaucheries look like results of mixing Methane and Lucan materials. Half of the redundancy is like Matthew, and the other half is like Luke." We come across this phenomenon yet again in Mark 9:38-41. This passage is interesting because Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have parallel stories of the strange exorcist. Mark and Luke share this story, however, it is just absent from Matthew. Yet Mark is peculiar in that he shares wording with the very end of a completely different passage from Matthew 10:40-42. On the hypothesis of Markan priority, we have to believe that Matthew just adopted the last sentence of Mark's story and completely ignored everything else. What possible reason could he have for doing that? Then Luke would have had to adopt Mark's entire story, but then drop the last sentence. What explanation can be given for this anomaly if Mark was written first? The hypothesis that Mark was writing last makes perfect sense of this situation. Mark wanted to include Luke's story, but also wanted to include this one statement from Matthew because it supported the moral of the story in Luke. Thus, he tacked on this single statement from Matthew at the end. Thomas Longstaff argues, it should be noted that the parallel between Mark and Matthew begins at precisely the point where the parallel between Mark and Luke ceases. An examination of these verses, taking account of the wider context in which they occur, will support the suggestion that the alteration of agreement between Mark and Luke and then between Mark and Matthew may be explained by the hypothesis that Mark has conflated the two Gospels when writing this section. As a final example, consider Mark 14:12 through 21. Mark's narrative begins by combining together both Matthew and Luke's introductory remarks. Mark follows Luke's wording when recounting the story of where Jesus told the disciples to find the room for the Passover, but right when Matthew and Luke's wording becomes very close when recounting what was said while they were eating, Mark suddenly switches and begins following Matthew's wording regarding Jesus' prediction of his own betrayal. As we noted earlier, this was the third telltale sign of conflation. Many more examples of this phenomenon of Mark alternately agreeing with Matthew's wording and then with Luke's wording could be brought forward. But I think I have presented enough for viewers to see that this is a pervasive phenomenon throughout Mark, and that, at least on its face, it makes a strong case for Mark having been the third gospel to have been written after Matthew and Luke. To say that Matthew and Luke depended upon Mark requires us to believe that Matthew and Luke conveniently just so happened to select opposite portions of Mark's narrative when they were using him in 17 different instances. Thomas Longstaff correctly concludes, it is somewhat as though Matthew and Luke were free to rewrite the Markan account only in those details where the other had substantially preserved the content and language of that source. Such an explanation would be inconsistent with the view that Matthew and Luke are independent of one another. Furthermore, even if we suppose that they knew one another, such an editorial method would be very difficult to understand, and no examples of it are known. While Griesbachian scholars had long used the argument from conflation for the posteriority of Mark, Thomas Longstaff gave the most detailed presentation of this argument in his masterful 1977 book, Evidence of Conflation in Mark. With a top scholar like Longstaff making a rigorous argument which clearly and convincingly indicated that Mark was the last synoptic gospel to have been written, a response from the Markan priorists was desperately needed. This response came in 1979 in the form of Christopher M. Tuckett's book, The Revival of the Griesbach Hypothesis. Tuckett utilized the research presented in Franz Niernick's 1972 book, Duality in Mark, to argue that Mark was simply a redundant writer. Citing Niernick's work, Tuckett argued that there were some 213 examples of redundancy in Mark's Gospel. Of these, only 17 examples could be brought forward where Matthew contained one half of the redundancy and Luke contained the other half. From this, Tuckett argued that it is entirely expected that if Matthew and Luke were writing after Mark, then they would be motivated to reduce Mark's redundancy. And given that there were some 213 examples of this sort of redundancy, presumably Matthew and Luke would have sometimes independently opted to remove different halves of the redundant statements. Therefore, when considered against the full range of redundancies in Mark, the fact that there are 17 examples of Matthew and Luke selecting different halves of Mark's wording is not all that surprising. As Tuckett says, on the theory of Markan priority, there is nothing surprising here. Mark is fond of dual expressions, and Matthew and Luke regularly omit some of his redundancy. Mark's pleonastic style can only be explained by his conflating his two sources in 17 out of 213 cases. He could have taken over a dual expression from one of his sources in 49 cases, but in the remaining 147, he must have created the duplicate expression himself. Thus, the vast majority of pleonasms must, on either hypothesis, be due to Mark's own style. Tuckett further argued that the phenomenon of alternating agreement between Matthew and Luke, which Longstaff had identified in the relevant pericopes, was essentially subjective and was a predetermined result of Longstaff's methodology. He writes, The method itself of deciding which of the other two Gospels Mark is closer to is bound to produce the pattern of alternating agreement which Longstaff finds so significant. For if one goes through the Markan text, deciding at every word or phrase which of Matthew or Luke is closer to Mark's text, then one will get blocks which, since there are only two possibilities, can only alternate with each other. Thus, the pattern of alternating agreement and the phenomenon of an alleged conflator's occasionally switching sources at a point of verbal agreement between his sources are both results which are predetermined by the method itself. Tuckett's critique proved to be quite persuasive to scholars, and for over 20 years it was considered to be the last word on the subject by many. That is, until the publication of Delbert Burkett's book, Rethinking the Gospel Sources, published in 2004, reopened the case for conflation in Mark. Burkett pointed out several problems with Nearneck's methodology for determining cases of redundancy in Mark's Gospel, and how he had artificially inflated the actual number of redundancies. The lists from Nearneck, from which Tuckett drew most of his examples, are the following: 10. Double statement, temporal or local; 11. Double statement, general and special; 12. Double statement, repetition of the motif; and 13. Synonymous expressions. Except for the first, these categories are either too limited or too ill-defined for our purpose. For example, Nearneck's category 11 consists of dual expressions where one is a special case of the other. This category has only 28 instances to begin with, and once we eliminate questionable instances, only 5 remain. Category 12 is too ill-defined. Nearneck designates this category as double statement, repetition of the motif. We might expect, then, instances where Mark makes the same statement twice. In fact, however, most of these instances cited by Nearneck do not fulfill this criterion. The same is true for Nearneck's category 13. Burkett goes through the problems with Nearneck's specific examples in much more painstaking detail than I am going to do in this video, but suffice to say that Nearneck's 213 examples of duality in Mark, which formed the basis of Tuckett's objection to the argument from conflation, is artificial. The vast majority of these alleged examples of dual expressions in Mark are not actually examples of duality at all. I would take Burkett's point even further. Burkett is willing to acknowledge 32 of Nearneck's examples of redundancy in Mark's special material as being genuine, but I am not willing to grant even these 32 examples. As I examined each and every one of them in my own research, I found that 14 of them didn't even exhibit apparent redundancy, 3 of them were simply clarifications, and 12 were elaborations on earlier statements rather than genuine examples of redundancy. I found that only 3 of the examples in Mark's unique material can plausibly be considered genuine examples of redundancies, and even these 3 are quite different from the sort of redundancies we looked at in the triple tradition. Mark 5:5a says, "Constantly night and day he was screaming among the tombs." It must be admitted that if someone is constantly screaming, then this straightforwardly entails that they are screaming night and day. But this redundancy can pretty easily be seen as serving the purpose of dramatic effect, something which cannot be said for most of the redundancies within the triple tradition. Mark 6:45 says, "And immediately Jesus had his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself dismissed the crowd." Strictly speaking, it is true that it is redundant to say that Jesus sent his disciples ahead while he stayed behind, but there is a lot of further explanation as to why Jesus stayed behind in the second clause. This is also not the case in most of the examples of redundancy in the triple tradition. Finally, Mark 11:11-12 says, "And Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple area, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. On the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry." These verses are quite redundant, saying twice that Jesus left Bethany. But notice that this example is unique in that it is the only example of redundancy where the exact same phrase is being used twice. So it supplies no support for Tuckett's thesis that the kind of redundancy demonstrated in the triple tradition can be explained by recourse to Mark being a habitually redundant writer, for the redundancy in the triple tradition does not involve duplication of the exact same words. To sum that up, there are only 3 genuine examples of redundancy in Mark's unique material. This makes it hard to sustain Tuckett's claim that Mark was a habitually redundant writer. Moreover, These three examples are relevantly different from the redundancies in the material in which Mark shares each half of his redundancy with Matthew and Luke. This raises the question very starkly, why do these redundancies only appear in the triple tradition? If, as Tuckett supposes, redundancy is just a characteristic of Mark, we might expect Mark's unique material to likewise exhibit this sort of redundancy. But we do not see this in Mark's unique material, and this seriously undermines the key premise of Tuckett's argument. Delbert Burkett further took Tuckett to task for his failure to appreciate the genuine phenomenon which Longstaff had uncovered back in 1977. Tuckett argued that the alternating agreement found by Longstaff is only a matter of degree and depends upon a subjective judgment. Doubtless this may be true in a few instances, but in most cases examined by Longstaff, it is clear where Mark is closer to Matthew and then when it is closer to Luke. In Mark 14:12-21, for example, when Mark agrees more closely with Matthew or Luke, the other synoptic generally either lacks the material in question or differs significantly. This alternating agreement is more than just a subjective judgment on Longstaff's part. In other words, in most of the putative examples of conflation in Mark which we have examined, the situation is not at all like Tuckett would have it, where we simply compare Mark to Matthew and Luke and determine that some places are closer to one or the other synoptic, thereby artificially creating the pattern of alternating agreement. Rather, the pattern is real because the agreement can usually be determined by reference to facts about Mark's text, whether that be his alternating verbatim agreement between Matthew and Luke, Matthew or Luke lacking sentences shared between Mark and the other synoptic, or the redundancies present in Mark, with only each half of the redundant statements being found in Matthew and then Luke. I therefore conclude that Tuckett's explanation for both the phenomenon of Mark's alternating agreements between Matthew and Luke, as well as for Mark's redundancies in the triple tradition, fails. Consequently, we may safely say that Markan priorists have failed to provide a better explanation for these facts than the conflation hypothesis, for which these facts are therefore evidence. The best explanation for these facts is that Mark knew Matthew and Luke's Gospels and that he combined them together. As Longstaff concludes, the pattern of alternating agreement between Mark and the other two Gospels occurs too frequently to be only the coincidental result of the two ways in which Matthew and Luke have independently used the Markan material, and therefore constitutes a serious anomaly for the two-document hypothesis. However, the analyses also show that this phenomenon may be explained by the hypothesis that Mark has conflated Matthew and Luke, a proposal which is strengthened by the observation that Mark's Gospel exhibits many of the literary characteristics which are known and representative examples of conflation. While I think that what I have already said is sufficient to pacify Tuckett's objection to the argument from conflation, we may observe that Tuckett's proposal has a number of other shortcomings. First, it fails to account for the fact that redundancy emerges as a telltale sign of conflation when known examples of conflation are analyzed. It relies on an ad hoc just-so story about Mark's literary tendencies. Second, Tuckett fails to explain the linguistic point highlighted by Farmer about Mark's using a rare term, which is characteristic of Matthew's Gospel. Finally, Tuckett has difficulty explaining why Matthew and Luke choose to alter Mark to the extent that they do, whereas the conflation hypothesis easily explains why Mark combines Matthew and Luke as he does. As Ward Powers points out in response to Tuckett, if Mark is prior, then it seems that Matthew and Luke have virtually taken turns in excising or altering things that Mark says. The extent of these differences is exceedingly high. Of the 11,078 words in Mark, Matthew has taken over only 4,230 words in parallel passages. That is, he has omitted or changed 61.8% of Mark's words. Of these 11,078 words in Mark, Luke has taken over only 2,675 words. That is, he has omitted or changed 75.9% of the words which he had in front of him in Mark. Why in these passages Matthew or Luke should both wish to change the text of Mark to this extent, and then in such different ways, is hard to explain. But the Mark independence hypothesis makes it simple to see what Mark has done. He has in front of him two somewhat different accounts of an event or saying of Jesus, and he blends the two by taking ideas, details, words, and grammatical structures from each. While the phenomenon of conflation in Mark may provide the strongest internal evidence for Mark's posteriority, there are several other facts about Mark in the other synoptics which suggest that Mark was written last. One of these is the abrupt ending of Mark. Mark ends with the discovery of the empty tomb and a declaration that Jesus has been risen, but there is no record of Jesus' appearances. The suggestion that the author of Mark did not know about these appearances is plainly false, for the appearances are predicted in Mark 16:7. If Mark's gospel was the first gospel to have been written, it is scarcely conceivable that he would have failed to discuss the resurrection appearances. However, this striking absence can be explained on the hypothesis that Mark was writing later than Matthew and Luke and knew full well that these appearances had already been documented. As Ward Powers argues, the risen Lord himself does not appear in Mark's gospel. There is an instruction for the women to report what they had seen, but there is no record that the women obeyed. There is a promise of a meeting in Galilee, but no record of it taking place. There is an implication in the final verse of fear and incredulity, but no record of how this became transmuted into joy and trust. All in all, this is a most unexpected way for the gospel to end. Apart from a lost ending hypothesis with its own inherent problems, there is only one explanation that can make sense of this situation. Mark had a restricted purpose in view in writing, and he did not seek to fill in all the gaps or to link his pre-resurrection presentation to the post-resurrection awareness of the church, because he was fully aware that the church already had gospels that did that. This means that he wrote in a situation where the church already possessed Matthew and Luke, or at least one of them, and that he took for granted the post-resurrection material and perspective that these other Gospels presented. Several of Matthew's omissions are likewise very difficult to explain on the hypothesis that he knew and used Mark's Gospel. The author of Matthew has a penchant for numbers and for money. He goes out of his way to mention these sorts of details when Luke and Mark often do not. It is Matthew's Gospel which features the parable of the unmerciful servant who, though forgiven a debt of 10,000 talents, refused to forgive a debt of 100 denarii. It is Matthew's Gospel which contains the parable of the landowner who agreed to pay his workers a denarius for the day. It is Matthew's Gospel in which we find the story of Peter finding a shekel in a fish's mouth. The author of Matthew's Gospel goes out of his way to mention the specific types of coins which he describes: quadrantes, asarion, didrachma, stater, and denarian. It is Matthew's Gospel which stresses that the disciples were not to bring gold, silver, or copper when ministering to the surrounding villages. As Michael Koch concludes, money is a recurring topic in passages which are unique to the Gospel of Matthew. Despite this tendency to go out of his way to include precise numbers, references to money, and even specific types of coins, on the hypothesis that Mark wrote first, we are expected to believe that Matthew just decided to leave out Mark's reference to the ointment and bread's worth as being 300 denarii in Mark 14:5. If Matthew was using Mark, he apparently wasn't interested in preserving Mark's precise reference to 2,000 pigs which ran over the hill in Mark 5:13, preferring instead to make a vague reference to the whole herd. If Mark wrote first, then we are expected to believe that Matthew just decided to delete Mark's story of the widow's gift, which explicitly mentions that the widow gave 2 small copper coins, despite his love for including stories which make reference to money. None of this coheres with the aforementioned evidence demonstrating Matthew's interest in money. However, it can be explained very easily on the hypothesis of Methane priority. Matthew did not include these precise facts and figures because he did not have access to Mark's Gospel. As Powers points out, in several parallel passages, Mark contains, and Matthew lacks, specific figures for numbers or amounts of money. There is no reason to believe that Mark was particularly interested in figures, yet his Gospel contains these details. Matthew, who is trained in handling finance and keeping records, puts into his account only vague generalizations precisely at these points in the record. The alternative is that Matthew's account lacked that information because it was a detail not known to him or possibly forgotten, whereas it was a detail known to Mark through his other source, Peter's preaching. But that Matthew had this precise information in front of him in Mark and deliberately made it vague in general? Impossible. This video has surveyed the internal evidence within the Synoptic Gospels for Mark's dependence upon the other synoptics. We have seen that Mark frequently conflates Matthew and Luke, that Mark's omission of the post-resurrection appearances is best explained by his knowledge that the other Gospels already contained these stories, and that Mark includes information absent from Matthew, which Matthew certainly would have included had he been using Mark. Taken together with the external evidence presented in my last video, we have strong reason to believe that the Gospel of Matthew was written first, the Gospel of Luke was written second, and the Gospel of Mark was written third. The two-gospel hypothesis stands as being the best explanation of the external and internal evidence bearing on the synoptic problem.